such failures were barely noticed. By decade's end, lobotomy had won the acceptance of mainstream medicine. Lobotomies were being performed at Johns Hopkins, Mass General Hospital, the Mayo Clinic, and other elite medical institutions. And in 1949, lobotomy received its highest endorsement when Igaz Moniz was awarded the Nobel Prize.
That's mainstream medicine saying this is a great thing. This is an incredible advance. I think it's Mental Hygiene News adopts as its logo a light shining into darkness, and the light is lobotomy, and the past is the darkness. So when you look back and you say, how is this monster going around introducing this to asylum medicine? He's not that. He's going to places that have been exposed as sort of snake pits, and he's bringing this light.
I remember one Saturday afternoon, there was a man who had barricaded himself in the bedroom with a hatchet and was going to kill his wife. And someone remembered that Dr. Freeman was this man's psychiatrist. So they called him up at home. He dressed and came out, pounded on the bedroom door and said, "This is Dr. Freeman, John, come out." And he said to the policemen that were there, "Hold him down." And he proceeded to do a bilateral transorbital lobotomy on him.
In his early days, Freeman had called lobotomy an operation of last resort. By the early 1950s, it was an operation he would perform anytime, anywhere.
Freeman could go into a mental hospital and say, "Line up your chronic psychosis patients," and they'd be lined up. They're on a series of beds, and he would intervene in them one after another. There was no question of asking the patients or their families for permission, no question of consulting the nursing staff. He was literally a little god.
At Cherokee State Hospital in Iowa, 3 of Freeman's patients died on the operating table. One after Freeman's ice pick slipped while he was taking a photograph. Without pausing, he packed up and left for his next demonstration.
It wasn't that he pulled the wool over anybody's eyes. He was an apostle. He was a crusader. What he believed was genuinely effective.
Increasingly, Freeman's crusade was aimed at lifers, the poorest and most vulnerable mental patients, abandoned by their families and living for years as wards of the state. In 1952, Freeman embarked on what he called his West Virginia Lobotomy Project. Over a 30-day period, in one of the nation's poorest states, he would operate on 238 patients, an average of almost 8 per day. One of Freeman's favorite stops in West Virginia was the small town of Lakin, home to the Hospital for the Colored Insane.
Budget was a real problem. Supplies was a problem. Didn't have towels for patients, didn't have clothing for patients. We did not have sheets to cover, to give every person a sheet. Poor folks are the ones who end up most of the mental institution. If you can afford other kinds of treatments, you don't end up there.
Unable to pay for its committed patients, West Virginia was threatening to close down Lakin and hospitals like it. But Dr. Freeman offered a cost-effective solution. Lobotomy, he promised, gets them home.
Here, he moved off the ground where he was on very solid grounds for relieving the mental distress of the individual to relieving the state of the burden of financial medical care. That, I think, for very good reasons, was the wrong thing to do.
I think Dr. Freeman believed, and I think the public believed, that this was going to be a magical cure. But when you shoot in the dark, you don't know what you're doing, you just shoot. Hopefully it'll come out right, some kind of way.
By the mid-1950s, the first long-term clinical studies of lobotomy had begun to appear in medical journals. Now, the medical community could assess lobotomy's true impact.
Some people can't leave the institutions, and they're almost in a vegetative state. Some people go home, but there's just sort of like children around the home. And at the best, we can see some people that have jobs, but so often they're not motivated really to go to the jobs. So now we have a longer term. We're 10 years, 12 years, and it's really starting to harder to justify this as a miracle surgery just because we see these long-term results.
Many who had once supported lobotomy began to disavow it. It is inconceivable, reported the American Medical Association, that any procedure which effectively destroys the brain could possibly restore the patient to a normal state. Lobotomy, one former supporter declared, was really no more subtle than a gunshot to the head. Especially vehement were Freudian psychoanalysts who condemned lobotomy as a brutal assault on the brain. But Walter Freeman had little patience for his critics.
Psychoanalysts did not take schizophrenic patients. They couldn't have talking sessions with someone who thought voices were coming out of the toilet bowl. So that if anyone wanted to criticize Freeman at a meeting, he would say, "What can you do for a patient like this? What can you do for them?" And they could do nothing.
They have no conception of what it's like to be suffering the demons of mental illness. He was trying to cure them of that. And the fact that they might turn into, let's say, fat slobs afterwards was a small price to pay for the relief from this intense mental anguish. He pointed out repeatedly a very high rate of suicide of these individuals, that they can't stand this mental pain, and he was helping them.
Many of Freeman's patients and their families felt they had been helped. Once, during a speech in front of an audience of psychiatrists, Freeman was heckled.
He reached under the podium, a big box of over 500 Christmas cards we received that Christmas, dumped them on the table and said, "How many Christmas cards did you get from your patients?"
Of course, you know what my wife went through. She never will be herself fully again. But if she had not got the operation you gave her, she probably would not be in shape to enjoy life as she is today.
I want to tell you, Dr. Freeman, that my brother Abe is still with me, just as happy and carefree as a child. May God bless you and yours always for your kind interest in me and my brother.
If you've agreed to allow this sort of procedure on somebody near and dear to you, you want to believe that you have made the best possible decision for that person. And what you would have a very hard time living with, I suggest, is the notion that you've inflicted, rather than a cure on somebody you care for, permanent damage.
The question of whether lobotomy was a valuable therapy or a medical travesty could not be decided by science alone.
Is the absence of pain what we should look for? Is the absence of suffering? Is the absence of caring? The absence of anxiety? Is that a good thing, or is that what makes us human? That's really what the core of this is. What do we value about the human mind? He chose not to value certain things, but that's what this raises so much, is what do we value about being human?
Ultimately, the fate of lobotomy would be settled by a pill. In 1954, a new drug called Thorazine began to sweep through state mental hospitals.
Thorazine was initially marketed as a chemical lobotomy. I mean, this was seen as a selling point, that it produced results similar to lobotomy, but without, of course, all the risks of the surgery.
With a viable alternative now in hand, the medical community turned decisively against lobotomy.
There were people parading at neurosurgical meetings that this was something atrocious, and that nobody should have their brain operated on for the ideas or thoughts or behavior that they're demonstrating.
Overnight, Freeman's opportunities to perform lobotomy began to disappear.
His office in George Washington University was closed. His teaching assignments were canceled. His hospital practices at D.C. General were forfeit.
At this point, Freeman couldn't give up lobotomy because to give up lobotomy, I think, meant giving up being Walter Freeman. He saw himself so strongly as the lobotomist, the man who could salvage patients from the dead. To cast that aside, regardless of the arguments for casting it aside, was just too much for him.
Freeman decided to move to Los Altos, California, to resurrect his career. Far from the reproachful Eastern medical establishment, he could try to bring lobotomy to new categories of patients.
If housewives found their early 1950s existence too depressing for words, why Freeman had a solution that would get them through their day happy as little clams. If children were misbehaving, conditions we might now see being called hyperactivity disorder, why they might need a lobotomy.
Howard Dully was 12 years old when he was brought to see the famous doctor. Howard had become disrespectful, his stepmother told Freeman, and occasionally violent at home.
My problem with her was that I felt she was trying to replace my mom, and I resented that, which I feel would be a natural reaction for a kid whose mom died. Acting up is the only way I could show my resentment.
Howard's stepmother visited Freeman's office almost a dozen times to have him evaluated. Sessions Freeman summarized in case notes.
October 26, 1960. Howard is rather evasive about talking about things that go on in the home. Howard seems to have poor muscular control. He objects to going to bed, but then sleeps well. He does a good deal of daydreaming. He turns the room lights on when there's broad sunlight outside. He hates to wash. He puts on a sweater on the hottest days and goes without an undershirt on chilly ones. I think it would be pretty much of a shame to wish Howard on anybody. I explained to Mrs. Dully that Howard was unapproachable by psychotherapy and that the family should consider the possibility of changing Howard's personality by means of transorbital lobotomy. Mrs. Dully said it was up to her husband. I would have to talk to him and make it stick.
10 weeks later, Walter Freeman lobotomized Howard Dully.
I didn't know it was going to be done. I didn't know it was done until 3 weeks afterwards when I was told by Freeman. I didn't want to know any more about it because I was concerned that there might have been some reason that I did deserve this. That's what I was afraid of. What had I done that I don't know about that one would deserve this?
In all, Freeman lobotomized 19 children under the age of 18, including a 4-year-old.
I've always felt that something was taken from me, that there was a piece missing because my life has never gone well. Some of my judgment is not good. I don't have the drive that a normal person has. I had trouble almost all my life. Almost anything I did, work, relationships, money. I mean, I wasted my whole life on this one issue. The whole life.